By Excalibur Insurance Management Services.
We welcome to today's show John Hirschaue and Ann Winsock to discuss the human cost of Governor Tom Wolf's ordered closure of two state hospitals, that being Polk Center in Venango County and Whitehaven Center right here in northeastern Pennsylvania. Ann is from Shavertown, but she was originally from Exeter, Pennsylvania. She graduated from Wyoming Area High School and later went on to Wilkes University. She is a structural interior design specialist and owns her own company. She is here today to discuss her sister Janine, who is a resident at Whitehaven Center and is severely disabled. She is also a party and moving party in a lawsuit against Governor Wolf aimed at preventing the closure of the hospitals that he has ordered. Our second guest, John Hirschaue, is a journalist and was recently a fellow in political journalism at the National Review. You may remember the National Review was the baby of famous and internationally famous conservative author and speaker William F. Buckley Jr., and he was the William F. Buckley Fellow at the National Review. John has been a published author in several national publications, including the New York Times. His focus in journalism has been on the deinstitutionalization and related issues affecting people with psychiatric and severe mental disabilities. He has testified as an expert before the Pennsylvania Senate hearing on the pending closures of Whitehaven and Polk. John received his degree in economics upon his graduation from Fairfield University in Connecticut and has extensive experience as a volunteer at a state-run facility where he now sits on its board of directors.
This is the Volpe Report, a weekly news and political interview show examining the latest local, state, and national issues with Chuck Volpe. Insightful, informative, controversial. The area's premier political talk show, the Volpe Report.
Welcome to the Volpe Report. We're here today with John and with Ann to talk about a very serious issue in Pennsylvania. You may remember, and for my guest benefit, we talked briefly that in this issue, from the Volpe Report standpoint, talked about Whitehaven, and actually back then we were talking about a prison, and not a hospital, but a prison, which was Retreat, that was being closed down by the governor. So we talked about them in separate ways. I mean, in one case you have residents, and it's more obviously a hospital type setting, and Whitehaven, which is Whitehaven, and then Retreat is a prison with prison guards. And we talked with Senate Leader Johnny Beechak about the devastating economic impact both would have in Louisiana County. But this show is a little bit different, so I just want to clarify for the audience that they've heard me talk about this subject before. We're not talking about Retreat or the prison. That's a separate issue. We're talking specifically about the closure of hospitals and necessary services and medical care that's required, in my belief, and I've said so before, in Pennsylvania. And what we're dealing with today, we're going to start with the lawsuit. But I think before we start with the lawsuit, we have John, of course. Let me just get over to John, as my audience has heard about your expertise. You are an expert in this matter. You're a fellow for the National Review. You've written many articles that have been published. You've been published in the New York Times. As I said off camera in my old trial lawyer days, I asked you if you were an expert. You were kind of modest and hesitated. I said, no, you are. A judge would acknowledge you as an expert. And Ann, you are really kind of the progenitor, really the reason we're here before we can get to John's expertise, because you have a family member, your sister.
Yes.
It's a patient at I should say, a resident at Whitehaven. And as my audience has heard, I have sincerely been, that's a real understatement of our governor and a lot of things. They heard me all spring rail against him about his unconscionable air and cataclysmic shutdown of the economy. It was done unfairly, without rhyme or reason. I believe in violation of several of the Bill of Rights and our most sacred constitutional rights, like the 5th, the 6th, the 14th Amendment, just to name a few. So, and one of the issues for me with the governor back then, which we'll get to your issue in a second, was when he shut down the Pennsylvania economy, he just did it. There was no notice. There was no collaboration. He didn't consult, as he should have, the heads of the House and Senate in terms of leadership. He should have consulted business leaders and medical leaders to talk about the impact on our Commonwealth, which has been nothing short of devastating as we look back. Well, I found out from you, I didn't know this, but pretty much, and we're going to start with you, Ann, he did the same thing here, like where it just, without any collaboration, without any notice, you hear from your sister, and like you said earlier, you know, she had a mosquito bite, she would have called you, and all of a sudden you find out that they're just shutting the place down, like, which motivated you to do something about it. You're a plaintiff in the lawsuit, Ann, so take it from there and tell us how we start.
I would first like to say Janine is profoundly mentally and physically challenged. Janine would not be able to make a call to me. Janine can only say 10 simple little words, and they wouldn't be acknowledgeable, or you would not be able to understand what she was saying. Someone that took care of her for many years doesn't always understand what those 10 words are. So
How old is Janine?
Janine is 50, but she is at the intellectual level of 18 months of age, just so we can set that. And there are 100 residents in Whitehaven Center, and the majority of them are diagnosed psychologically 6 to 18 months of age. So the public would understand how profound they are. And we have 197 additional individuals in the Polk Center in Venango County. I can't.
Also being closed down?
Yes, absolutely. We're a team. We're a team in the lawsuit. We're a team on closing date. We're combined. Getting back to that particular day, it was about noon on August 14th, I believe. Turned my television on, and I saw a news anchor come on TV to say, shocking, Whitehaven Center is closing. I immediately called the social worker, and I said, oh my God, what is happening? I was devastated. She said, we just found out a moment ago. The state walked in the building and said, we are closing. I jumped in my car, I drove to Whitehaven Center, and there were a gathering of guardians and family members and news media. And it was really very shocking to us. And I knew Governor Wolf was behind this.
He was.
The thing that is so devastating, and one of the reasons we had to open this lawsuit, hundreds of us, I am one, my family members, along with I and many of the guardians and family members between both facilities, have countless times dialed daily to Governor Wolf and his constituents. No one would speak to us. Governor Wolf would not come to the facility and meet any of us. He has never spoken a word to any of us guardians. We wanted him to see who he was hurting. This is so reckless. These are people, they cannot go to the bathroom on their own. They need to be diapered. They need to be fed. Many of them have feeding tubes. They cannot speak. My sister is blind. She cannot see. She is severely autistic. Suffers from bipolar 1 disorder. They don't like using the word retardation, but she suffers from severe retardation. Other complicated medical issues also, and other psychiatric issues.
And she's not unique, Ann, I'm guessing.
She is not unique, and what is even more shocking, she is not the using the word worst. She's not
Her
the
patient.
worst patient up there, resident patient.
Okay.
They need 24-hour care. They need nursing procedures every so many hours. They need to be fed. They need to be cared for. They need to be supervised around the clock. My sister is extremely complicated case. She would not even be ideal to go into another facility. She absolutely is not somebody that can go into a small group home. That would be out of the question. My very first call on that day, when I got back from hearing about this closure, was up to St. Joseph's in Scranton.
Okay.
Janine would not be a candidate to go to St. Joseph's. So I am really going to be in a very bad position. I told Kevin Dressler, I know Governor Wolf is behind this before we heard anything, and I will not compromise my sister. If I have to relocate and start my life over, I will not jeopardize Janine. I will not put her in a compromising position where she would be overdrugged somewhere so people could cope with her. I will completely change my life if I have to, but we shouldn't have to. We pay taxes in this state. I was reading this morning that the state of Pennsylvania paid out $1.3 billion to illegals.
Okay.
It costs about $39 million a year to run Whitehaven Center. My Polish family relocated in 1930 from Poland. We have been paying, large family, we have been paying taxes 90 years in this state. We have never left the state. Why on earth should I have to relocate to another state to try to get aid for my sister? And I should not have to drive 3 or 4 hours each week either to visit her somewhere else.
In your family's life, in countless families' life. Before we go to break, and that was a wonderful a summary of why this started and what the issues are from a factual and emotional standpoint. I think people they'd have to be zombies not to feel the genuine emotion and heart that awaits if this occurs. Let's talk about John's involvement. And we're going to turn to you now, John. How did you get involved in this process?
So I grew up in a town in Connecticut that had one of these state institutions. Okay, so I had firsthand experience as a volunteer, and ultimately I ended up sitting on a board of directors there. So I'm very involved with the facility, and I know
An expert.
the profile of the type of person who resides in a center like this. And I think it's important to situate what's going on with the centers now in the context of Pennsylvania's history with people with disabilities. Around the turn of the 20th century, really the only way that people with disabilities were cared for were in these large antediluvian state institutions. You know, you've heard all the horror stories of Pennhurst and all of the terrible warehouses where people used to be held. And there were terrible conditions in a lot of them, and anybody who's involved in disabilities knows that and concedes that. There are over 20 instituted in Pennsylvania, and as civil rights litigation became underway, there were a lot of people in these places who really didn't need to be there. Okay, people who were not terribly, profoundly disabled. They didn't have behavioral challenges. They were just a little different, right? And oftentimes they were warehoused in these places, and it was a terrible human rights tragedy. Okay, and it's important not to lose sight of that, and I wouldn't lose sight of that for a moment. But what happened is, over the course of decades, as facilities began to downsize, people move out, the state closes a lot of these facilities. You've gone from over 20 facilities now to 4 facilities that are left in the state of Pennsylvania.
Does that include
Including Polk and Whitehaven centers. There's Evansburg and Selinsgrove are the other 2.
So we'd be down to 2?
We'd be down to 2 state centers if these closures go through. But I think it's important to establish that the people who remain in these centers, by definition, are the most severely and profoundly medically and behaviorally involved residents we have in the state, because otherwise they would have moved out already.
Like Janine.
Yes.
By definition, if you remain in one of these centers, you are among the most profoundly challenged members in the state of Pennsylvania. So they have been looking for alternatives for people who live in Polk and Whitehaven Center. They're offered, as a part of the Benjamin settlement, every year the opportunity to leave and live in a community setting. And
What's the Benjamin settlement?
The Benjamin settlement was a lawsuit, I think from the late 90s, early 2000s. I don't know the date precisely, but the point of it was it established certain guidelines for moving someone from an institution into the quote-unquote community, a group home, an independent apartment, some alternative arrangement that ultimately they want to move the residents from Polk and Whitehaven to. And I just think that it's important to establish that these family members are given the opportunity to leave. They're given the opportunity to relocate their loved ones. It's not as though they've never heard of the community before. They've heard of it every year, but they've chosen of their own free will and volition not to move. And I think that ought to be respected. And
That's a major factor, I would think, in the legal. It's not a case that they've been forced to be in there, and the government or Commonwealth can make the argument, well, we don't even know if a lot of them would want to be there anyway. No, they're there by their own choice.
And in 2011, I think this is so important. Protection and Advocacy Organization in Pennsylvania, which by its very nature opposes institutionalization. This is sort of the ideology that's overtaken a lot of these groups, is opposing institutionalization per se. They sanctioned a survey of state center residents and their guardians in 2011. Of the 1,013 families who responded to the survey, 985, that's 97%, said they did not want to move their loved one to an alternative arrangement. Of the 307 residents capable of responding, 271 said they did not want to move.
Overwhelming it.
Overwhelming. And what does this say to me? This says to me that the people in the state, in the department, who talk about people with disabilities being self-advocates and advocating for themselves. And when a person with a disability speaks, we ought to listen to them. Well, why don't we listen to these people who have told us what they want? Why don't we listen to the guardians who have told us what they want? Well, this is what they'll say in response. It's important to kind of take this argument apart. What they'll say in response is, well, they don't know anything different. I mean, they've lived in an institution their whole lives. This is all they ever know. They're sort of fuddy-duddies, actually, sort of an insult. And, when they move into the community, they'll be satisfied then. Now, this sort of breaks down upon basic scrutiny. When people live in a group home, or in a community apartment, or in some alternative arrangement, we don't say to you, well, you're satisfied with your arrangement, but we're only going to take you at your word once we forcibly remove you from that group home, put you in an institution, and then we'll take you at your word that you're satisfied. But you have to experience the alternative first before we take you at your word. Now what the state is saying is, well, maybe the residents say they're satisfied, but we can't trust them because they don't know what a group home is like, right? The guardians don't know. They're afraid of change. This is what the department will say. Oh, well, change is scary. Yeah, change is scary for everyone. Change would be scary for a group home resident being forcibly displaced. If someone says they're satisfied and they have more knowledge of the intimate medical details of their loved one's care than a bureaucrat in Harrisburg ever will, they know firsthand what their loved one needs, the type of support they need behaviorally and medically to thrive. And it's their life that matters. It's not some abstract ideology that matters. These are actual human beings. And that is what matters. And if we lose sight of that for this very paradisiacal ideology that people can live in the community and thrive, and plenty of people can, by the way, and I'm happy for them, and everybody, Ann and I are both happy for somebody who says, I live in a community setting and I love it. Great. Nobody's saying you have to move out.
Capable of it.
Yes.
Exactly.
Nobody's saying, you know what, you have to leave and go to Polk. No, it's people who have decided of their own free will and volition to live in a quote-unquote institution, in a brick building, heaven for a family, in a brick building, right? They should be able to make that choice without interference from the state because the state thinks they know better.
Well, we're at our break, and when we come back, I'm going to come back to John a bit and talk about some of the issues. Again, we're here with Ann and John. John and his expertise, as you're starting to hear, and we'll hear more afterwards. He has already educated me. I could have spent hours in a class, and I've learned in a half an hour from him. And you heard from a very emotional and a sense of conviction and a sense of hurt from Ann about her sister Janine. So hopefully in a relatively short time we've kind of crystallized some of the issues that will be going forward and we're faced with in this state. So we'll be back in a moment after these messages.
Catch Volpe's Views every Tuesday on the Fox 56 News First at 10.